Greetings, friends and brethren. This is Dr. Bob Thiel of the Continuing Church of God. Today I'd like to talk about the judgments in the book of Exodus. This is actually the 8th part of a multi-part series covering all the verses of the book of Exodus. And we're going to begin with Exodus chapter 21, which talks about judgments. And so if you've got your Bible, you might want to follow along. We'll be mostly in Exodus today, but we'll go to some other portions of the Bible as well. So it starts off in Exodus 21, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them." Now I'd like to read a little bit of what, not too much, but the old Radio Church of God wrote about this. It said, this is from the late Dr. Herman Hay, somebody who I did know. "When God brought Israel to the foot of Mount Sinai, he gave the 10 Commandments to them. He allowed Moses to declare all the statutes and judgments to Israel." And talk about Exodus 20 to 24. "These statutes and judgments magnify the 10 Commandments." So this is from the Good News magazine of November 1957, which is called "Which Old Testament Laws Should We Keep Today?" Now, before we get to specific ones, I want to go to Genesis. You don't have to go there. I'm just going to go to a couple of verses. Genesis chapter 26, starting in verse 4. I'm going to read something that God said to Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. Genesis 26, 4. "And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham has obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." I'd like to read something else, this time from the old Worldwide Church of God, also by Dr. Hay. And this actually was in the Good News magazine in October, November of 1983, which laws in the Old Testament have authority today. And so let me read this. It says, "Abraham kept the 10 Commandments. He also kept God's statutes and laws." And that's why I read from Genesis chapter 26. And for Abraham, by the way, to have kept God's commandments and statutes and laws, he must have known what some of them were. A lot of them are not instinctive. Anyway, Herman Hay wrote, "What were these statutes and laws?" And he continues with, "In addition to the broad principles of the 10 Commandments, God gave the patriarchs statutes for the general well-being of the people, together with judgments for the protection of everyone's legal rights." And they had legal rights back then, which, presuming people would do what the Bible said, would be trampled upon much less than supposed rights that we have in the 21st century. Anyway, Dr. Hay continues with, "Statutes are lesser expressions of a lawmaker, usually binding or forbidding certain things be done. Judgments are binding decisions of judges based on God's previously revealed law. These decisions are used to settle similar future disputes and to render a sentence or verdict." Herman Hay continues with, "In general, the 10 Commandments apply to individual conduct. Let me read that again. In general, the 10 Commandments apply to individual conduct. The statutes to national or church affairs, and judgments related to decisions rendered according to the principles of the 10 Commandments and the statutes." So that's kind of an introduction and a little bit of what the old Worldwide Radio Church of God said about these. So now let's go back to Exodus 21, and we'll pick it up in verse 2. "If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go free and pay nothing." So they enslaved their people. It wasn't permanent. "If he comes in by himself, he's going to go out by himself. If he comes in married, his wife will go out with him." Okay, so the Hebrews had limits on slavery. And this somewhat reminds me of what they used to call indentured servants in the Americas. The indentured servants were basically Europeans who agreed to work for other Europeans in the Western Hemisphere as long as they would pay to get them over here. So suppose you were back in the 1600s, maybe 1700s or so, and you're not doing so well, or you don't think your prospects in your country are that good. You might say, maybe I want to go somewhere else. Maybe I want to go to the New World, as it was known. Well, you didn't have any money, and perhaps that's one of the reasons you wanted to leave. You didn't have any money. So what you would do is you could agree to go to work basically as a slave or indentured servant for so many years, and they would pay to bring you over here, and you'd have to work. So anyway, that's something that used to happen over here. Anyway, it's going back to Exodus, now starting in verse 4. If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and the children will be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. So if you were a servant back then, and you were offered a wife from your master, you better think hard about this one, because if you don't want to stay there, you lose your family. Verse 5, but if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, my children, I will not go free. Then his master will bring him to the judges, they'll bring him to the door of the doorpost, and his master will pierce his ear with an awl, and he will serve him forever. So they may have put some kind of an earring here for that. Anyway, it's going back to Exodus, this time verse 7 of Exodus 21. If a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. So the Bible is recognizing the differences for various reasons for males and females. Verse 8, if she doesn't please her master, who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since she has dealt deceitfully with her. I thought what I'd like to do with this particular section is I'd like to read from Young's literal translation, because I think it gives a better sense of what's happening here than the New King James does, which is what I'm mostly going to be reading. This is from the Young's literal translation, Exodus chapter 21, starting verse 7. And when a man sells his daughter for a handmaid, she does not go out according to the going of the men servants. If evil in the eyes of her lord, so that he has not betrothed her, then let her be ransomed to a strange people. He has not power to sell her. He is dealing treacherously with her. And this has to do with he made certain promises to her, and the Bible has specifics to let her go free. Anyway, back to Exodus now, verse 9. If he's betrothed her to his son, he shall not deal with her according to the custom of the daughters. Or he shall deal with her according to the custom of the daughters. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food or clothing or her marriage rights. And if he does not do these three for her, she shall go free without paying money. And that's the other parts. The Bible basically says, by the way, if men had more than one wife, and they shouldn't, by the way, Jesus said one man and woman should be just basically one. But if they had more than one wife, he couldn't decide, I like the second one better, or maybe the younger one better, or whatever one better, and then not take care of the other wife. And the Bible says, no, he has to take care of them all. All right, anyway, back to Exodus 21, starting verse 12. He who strikes a man so that he dies shall be surely put to death. Now, then there's some more specifics about this. Because how did he strike him? Was it like on purpose? Or maybe they were building something together, or they were chopping down trees or whatever? It's verse 13. However, if he didn't lie in wait, but God delivered him in his hand, then I'll appoint a place where you may flee. Now this is more complicated than it kind of sounds on the surface, and I'd like you to go to the book of Numbers. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you where I'm going to Numbers. Numbers chapter 35. Starting in verse 9. So let me back up on that in case you hadn't gotten there yet. So I have to give you some opportunity to get there. Numbers 35, starting verse 9. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall appoint cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the manslayer who kills any person accidentally may flee there. There shall be cities of refuge for you from the avenger. that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation in judgment. So basically, if you killed somebody by accident, you could run to these certain cities, and the relative who's there who would want to avenge this person can do this until you get to go before the judges and say, look, it was an accident. Now, if they didn't believe it was an accident, they think it was on purpose, you would be killed. But if they did think it was an accident, you didn't just get off. Okay, you had to stay in that city for a long time, actually till the high priest died, which could be a matter of, I suppose, maybe sometimes a couple of days, but more likely years, maybe even decades. Anyway, verse 13 of Numbers 35. And of the cities which you shall give, you'll have 6 cities of refuge, 3 on this side of the Jordan, and 3 cities you'll appoint in the land of Canaan. So different sizes of the river, which will be cities of refuge. These 6 cities will be refuge to the children of Israel for the stranger and the sojourner among them, that anyone who kills a person accidentally may flee there. Verse 16. But if he strikes him with an iron implement so that he dies, he's a murderer, and that murderer shall be surely put to death. If he strikes him with a stone in the hand, by which one could die, and he does die, he's a murderer, and he shall surely be put to death. I think it's trying to say if it's a big enough stone, if someone had a little rocket or how, maybe something different. Verse 19. The avenger of blood himself shall put verse 18. If he strikes with a wooden hand weapon, by which one could die, and he does die, he's a murderer, and murderer shall be put to death. Verse 19. The avenger of blood himself shall put the murderer to death when he meets him, and he shall put him to death. If he pushes him out of hatred, or while lying in wait, hurls something at him so that he dies, or in enmity, he strikes him with his hand so he dies. So he's just mad at him, he hits him. The one who struck him shall surely put to death. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. So you see the penalties of killing somebody, whether on purpose or by accident, were pretty severe. And if you killed somebody by accident, and you had to stay there for a long, long time, people would be more careful about not killing people by accident. So in a sense, it's kind of like a first safety warning. Anyway, let's go back to Exodus 21, verse 14. But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor, to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. Now verse 15. And he who strikes his father or mother shall surely be put to death. Now it doesn't say if you killed your parents, you're not supposed to hit your parents. Now, verse 16. He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he's found in his hand, shall be surely put to death. So we see that kidnapping was considered a capital crime back then, and in certain lands it still is today. Now, continuing Exodus, verse 17 of chapter 21. He who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. So we see in verse 15 and verse 17 severe penalties for hitting or cursing your parents. Now, perhaps I should mention that verses 15 and 17 were part of the 613 regulations called mitzvahs that certain Jews, as well as Messianic Jews, consider are to be kept to this day. And we have an article, by the way, at the cogwriter.com website. That's www.cogwriter.com website, called Which Laws Were Superseded, Which Remain, to give some details about which statutes or laws are applicable and which ones are not. The ones we've been going through here are somewhat applicable, but not completely. And what do I mean by that? For example, we do not have civil authority to have avengers of blood or that kind of a thing, so we don't do that anymore. Some of these rules were for the civil authorities, as opposed to religious ones. On the other hand, we're not supposed to strike our parents. We're not supposed to curse our parents. We're not supposed to strike somebody that they might die. Okay, we don't have legal slavery now, so we don't have that issue to deal with. But if we did have legal slavery, the same issue, things the Bible said would be applicable for Christians. Okay, anyway, going back to Exodus 21:18, says, if men contend with one another, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he doesn't die but is confined to his bed. If he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him will be acquitted. He'll only pay for the loss of his time, and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. So, two men are fighting, or let's say, in like modern terms, a bar brawl or something. One of them hurts the other one. If the guy doesn't die, the guy who gets hurt doesn't die, the other guy has to pay for his lost time at work and his hospital expenses or medical expenses, if there are any. And that would still be a proper today. We're not supposed to get into fights, but if we were to do so, yes, I think we should follow this type of judgment here. Anyway, continuing, verse 20. And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod, so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. Now this, I think, sort of gives a wrong impression with the New King James. I want to read from the NIV. Now the NIV's got issues. It doesn't always use the right base scriptures, original scriptures. But sometimes they get their translators get things clearer. Anyway, the NIV says, anyone who beats their male or female servant with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But if they are not to be punished, the slave recovers a day or two, since the slave is their property. Okay. Anyway, let's go back to the New King James again, verse 22. If men fight and hurt a woman with child, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished according to as a woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and stripe for stripe. So caution around pregnant women was advised. Anyway, when we see the judgment penalties applied to violating certain laws and statutes, essentially we see that the punishments resemble the offense committed in some type in kind and degree. So, to use a modern term, the punishment should fit the crime. Now, unfortunately, modern times, punishments don't always fit the crimes. In the Old Testament, if you bear false witness against somebody, what you want to happen to them should happen to you. That doesn't happen like it should, definitely in places like the United States. If it did, people would hear and fear, and they would be less likely to make false accusations against other people. But we've seen in the media over the last year various false accusations put out by certain ones, and the people who made the false accusations didn't get any serious punishment. Now sometimes they do, but the ones I'm thinking didn't, and that's wrong. The punishment did not fit the crime. They were under-punished. Anyway, let's go back to Exodus 21, this time verse 26. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of the eye. If he knocks out a tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. So, while they did allow corporal punishment there was limits. You weren't to cause permanent damage. Anyway, if a slave can leave because they lost an eye or a tooth, it's certainly not fine for a master not to be punished if the slave dies a few days after he's beaten, which kind of the impression you get from Exodus 20 to 21 in the New King James, which is why I'd say the NIV before. Well, anyway, let's go back to Exodus 21, this time verse 28. If an ox gores a man or woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox will be acquitted. Okay, so it's not the owner's fault if an ox gets you. Okay, you should also be careful when you're around an ox. In modern times, we don't tend to have bulls, which is mostly what it's referring to here. What do you mean we don't have bulls? Isn't there bullfighting and things like that? Oh yeah, there's some of that. But around here specifically, they raise cows in the hillsides. They eat the grass, and they fertilize, and they keep the weeds down, the fire threat down. But what are out there, the types of cows, there's basically two types of cows out there. There are female cows, which are normally called cows, and there are castrated males, generally called steers. They're generally speaking don't have bulls out because bulls are dangerous, and they're harder to keep control of them, and so they usually handle them a different way. Anyway, in ancient times, again, there was certainly a risk with bulls. But look in verse 29. But if the ox tended to thrust its horn in times past, and it was made known to the owner, and he's not kept it confined so that it killed a man or a woman, the ox will be stoned, and its owner will be put to death. So yes, while bulls can be dangerous, if you know your bull is dangerous, and you know your bull is likely to go out and gore somebody, you're supposed to keep it confined, which basically in this area is what they do, because they keep the bulls somewhere else, so they're not out in the fields, up in the hillsides. Because steers and cows are not nearly as dangerous. It doesn't mean you can't get hurt by a steer or a cow, but it's less likely. So you see here that the owner couldn't just say, "It's not my fault that my ox gored you," if he knew his ox was dangerous. So it's a safety rule. It says, if there is imposed on him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life whatever is imposed on him. Whether it's gored a son or gored a daughter, according to this judgment, it should be done to him. If the ox gores a male or female servant, he shall give their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox will be stoned. Now, it didn't say he kills it. This one just gores it. So you're still supposed to be careful. You're supposed to be careful about dangerous animals. We have a situation nowadays, some people intentionally want to have dangerous animals, and biblically you're held responsible for that, and that's a judgment that they should do in modern times as well. Now let's go to verse 33. And if a man opens a pit, or a man digs a pit, and he doesn't cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in it, the owner of the pit shall make it good. He shall give money to their owner, but the dead animals be his. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Saying you can't make things dangerous for others or for animals. And if somebody's animal gets killed in your pit that you didn't make it so they wouldn't run into it, you've got to pay for the dead animal. You can keep the animal once it's dead. Okay, so this was to encourage economic encouragement of safety rules. Now let's go to the last couple of verses of chapter 21, starting verse 35. If a man's ox hurts anot's, so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money from it, and the dead ox they shall also divide. Or if it was known that that ox tended to thrust in the times past, and the owner has not kept it confined, he shall pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall be his own. Okay, so in this case, instead of the ox killing a person, it kills somebody else's ox. And then the Bible says, okay, then the dead one is his, he loses his. Now let's continue in Exodus chapter 22, start in verse 1. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is a little different than how it's normally done these days. You'll notice that the penalty for stealing something more valuable was even more. You only paid 4 sheep if you stole a sheep, but 5 oxen stole an ox. Now, I don't know how much sheep and ox go for these days, but for the sake of argument, let's say sheep, maybe they sell for around $200, and maybe ox sell for closer to $2,000, $1,500, whatever it is. I should have looked it up. So let's just say, let's just make it $200 for a sheep and $2,000 for an ox. And again, that might be too high, but I don't know exactly. So if you stole a $2,000 item, you have to pay back 5 times $10,000. you stole the $200 item, you had to pay back 4 times $800. So this would tend to discourage people saying, you know what, I can get rich by stealing more expensive things. Okay? And the world system doesn't seem to fully account for that. These days, I don't know how much they have thieves pay back. And back then, if you didn't pay back, then you became a slave. So anyway, the Bible shows that the more you steal, the more you have to pay back. Now let's go back to Exodus 22 now, verse 2. If a thief is found breaking in and he's struck so he dies, there shall be no guilt for this bloodshed. So if someone broke in at night and they got hit and they died, that was too bad for the person who broke in. This is to greatly discourage people from trying to break in during the night, excuse me. Now, if it happens during the day, verse 3, if the sun rises upon him, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. He should make full restitution. If he has nothing, he shall be sold for his theft. So the thieves have to pay. Anyway, verse 4, if the theft is certainly found in his hand, if they catch it red-handed, whether it's an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he's going to restore double. So before, it says, okay, if you go and you have some kind of a plot for an ox or a sheep, you go and take it and you either sell it or slaughter it, you're going to pay back 4 times for sheep and 5 times for ox. But if you get caught and you haven't done anything with it, you get to pay back double. Not just you just lose what you got, but you got to pay back double to discourage people from stealing. Verse 5, Exodus 22. If a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed and lets loose his animals, and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution for the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. So this is again has to do with how they were handling their livestock. So they had a lot of open land back then. You'd let your animals graze. Or animals needed to graze, by the way, and they need to eat. But you're not to let them go and say, oh, it's too bad that they ended up going in my neighbor's garden eating all their vegetables. For example, like goats would be inclined to do, amongst other things. Cows and sheep would do it too, but I think goats would be more inclined. So you had to keep your eye on your animals to be sure they weren't destroying anything for your neighbors, because if it did, you had to pay. Again, these judgments were to discourage people from being selfish, from hurting others. The Bible teaches responsibility. All right, now to verse 6 of Exodus 22. If fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that standing grain, or the field is consumed, he who kindles the fire shall surely make restitution. Okay, so if you had a campfire or some other kind of fire you did and ends up burning somebody else's crops, you have to pay. Verse 7. If a man delivers to his neighbor money or articles to keep, and it's stolen out of the man's house, if the theft is found, he shall pay double. If the thief is not found, then the master of the house shall be brought to the judge to see whether or not he's put his hands on his neighbor's goods. Now verse 9. For any kind of trespass, whether it concerns an ox, a donkey, a sheep, or clothing, or for any kind of lost thing, which another claims to be his, the cause of both parties shall come before the judges, and whoever the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. So if there's a dispute and you say, this is my book. No, it's my book. This is my book. This is, okay, so people argue whose this is, using this book as an example. And hopefully they wouldn't be arguing wrongly about wanting the Ten Commandments. The Bible says, in the Ten Commandments, by the way, it says, of course, don't bear false witness, and it also says don't steal. But if someone says something's theirs and it's not, they're bearing false witness and they're trying to steal. So, getting back to this, it says, whoever the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. Now verse 10. If a man delivers to his neighbor a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any animal to keep, and it dies, his herd is driven away, no one seeing it, then an oath of the Lord shall be between them both, that he has not put his hand against his neighbor's good, and the owner of it shall accept that, and shall not make it good. But if in fact it is stolen from him, he shall make restitution to the owner of it. If it's torn to pieces by a beast, he shall bring it as evidence, and it shall not make good what was torn. So, let's say you're going out of town, you have your neighbor watch your sheep, and you put your sheep in with his sheep, and some dogs or wolves or coyotes come by and they kill it. That was not considered the fault of the one that you lent it to. By the way, we used to have sheep, and we had problems with dogs of various kinds who would kill them if they could get to them. Even though our land was fenced, the dogs would go under it, around it, whatever they would do. Wild dogs, particularly. Anyway, verse 14. If a man borrows anything from his neighbor, and it becomes injured or died, the owner of it not being with it, he shall surely make it good. So if somebody lent you, if someone wanted to borrow from you, they wanted to borrow your goat for a while for whatever reason, say to get rid of weeds, that's a good thing for goats, and it dies when you borrowed it, you have to pay back. If the owner was with it, though, he doesn't have to make it good. Now, if it was hired, it came for his hire. Now, that last part's a little tricky to understand, so let me explain this. First of all, if you borrowed someone's goat and you're out there in your field and the owner is with it and the goat dies, while the owner's there, you were not considered to be responsible. But if it was hired, it came for its hire. What does that mean? Well, I want to read from the NIV. Again, not because it's a verse, it's always accurate, because, again, part of some of the underlying documents it translates from isn't always the right ones. But this time they got the understanding in modern English better than the New King James did. It says, but if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. If the animal was hired or rented, then the money paid for the hire covers the loss. So if you paid somebody to borrow you rented somebody's goats, and the goats died, and you didn't kill them, or you didn't do anything to cause them to die, and no, you don't have to pay the owner back because the owner got paid when you rented them. So that's basically that. Now let's go back to Exodus 22. Starting verse 16. If a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. If a father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins. Well, so the Bible is very, very clearly opposed to what we would call casual sexual encounters, like one-night stands or whatever. It says, look, if you do this, you're not married, you've got to get married. And the guy who does this has to do it, unless the father thinks the guy is so revolting or disgusting, or for whatever reason, doesn't want him, says you've got to pay, and you don't get the wife, you got to pay anyway. So that was a lot of money. It was not something super easy to do. So this was very discouraged. Okay, it should be discouraged more these days by society, but it's not. Instead, it's encouraged, which is wrong. Anyway, continuing Exodus 22, verse 18. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. The Bible was opposed to having witches and witchcraft and all that kind of stuff. Nowadays, a lot of people think it's cool to be engaged in witchcraft or these type of things, or things associated with sorcery, but the Bible is really strongly opposed to it. Going now to verse 19 of Exodus 22. Whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. We're likely to see promotions of various forms of bestiality in the future. I have heard and not seen that supposedly some of this stuff goes on the internet and other things. Anyway, going back to Exodus 22, verse 20. He who sacrifices to any god except the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. I want to go to the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. You might want to go there. I'm going to start in verse 19 and read a few verses. Because the New Testament also calls against combining pagan worship with the worship of the true God. So in 1 Corinthians 10, starting in verse 19, let me read something the Apostle Paul wrote. What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or that what's offered to idols is anything? Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I don't want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord, the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons. But some people think, no, it's okay they do this pagan stuff with this because this is all right, they're above this. Well, it says in verse 22, the Apostle Paul wrote, or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than He? Because God's Word says, don't be involved in pagan worship practices. Don't do that. Don't combine them with God's worship practices. Anyway, and before I go further, I guess when you look at various forms of Passover, they call it different things. But when they don't do the biblical symbols with unleavened bread and wine, plus they have various invocations and cantations and various symbols, things that just are not biblical, that's not something that should be done, and this is one of the things the Apostle Paul was warning about. Again, it's consistent with Exodus chapter 22, verse 20. Anyway, let's now go to verse 21. You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, in addition to trying to treat people properly, this reminds me how much the world seems to take an opposite view. If you ever look at hotel taxes or motel taxes, you'll see how much higher these taxes are in much of the United States than other sales taxes. They figure they can get away with cheating the stranger or ripping them off or making them pay more. Anyway, let's go back to Exodus 22, verse 22. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry at all to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will be widows, and your children fatherless. God's saying you need to treat widows and fatherless properly. You're not supposed to afflict them, and if you do, God will get His revenge. But people might think, widows, fatherless, they can't defend themselves, so we can get away with anything. God says no. And if you have more authority or power or whatever over someone, don't think that you can just get away with anything. God knows. God judges. I want to read something from Zechariah chapter 7. You might want to go there. Starting in verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, execute true justice, show mercy and compassion, everyone to his brother. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the alien or the poor. Let none of you plan evil in his heart against his brother. I'd want to go to the New Testament, James chapter 1, verse 27. We read something about widows and orphans here. James was inspired to write, James 1, verse 27. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. So notice that not only as Christians are we not supposed to afflict widows and orphans, we're supposed to help them. And that's something, the continuing Church of God, that we strive to do. Now let's go back to Exodus 22, this time pick it up in verse 25. If you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like a moneylender to him. You shall not charge him interest. So any interest, or even excessive interest, or any interest actually, was not allowed back then. You weren't a loan shark to the poor. Even though there are modern, what they call usury laws, the poor are often taken advantage of when it comes to this, and they're paying really high interest rates and payday loans and such. Hurt the poor. Anyway, let's go back to Exodus chapter 22, verse 28. You shall not revile God, nor curse the ruler of your people. Now the first part of this Seems related to the third commandment. But the second part seems to be an expansion, if you will, of the second commandment. This is supposed to help stability and proper governance. And I also say this has kind of a personal safety factor built into it. What do you mean a personal safety factor? Well, I'm going to read from Ecclesiastes chapter 10. I'm going to read verse 20 from there. Do not curse the king even in your thought. Do not curse the rich even in your bedroom. For a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell the matter. In those days, cursing a ruler or a rich person could get you killed. And if you look at what Revelation 13 talks about, with the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth coming up, people say things against those beasts in the wrong place, or publicly at least, will be put to death. Now, it doesn't mean we're supposed to embrace the beast, but the reality is be careful about various comments you have about various rulers. Anyway, let's go back to Exodus 22, starting verse 29. You shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices. The juices would be a manufactured item. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. Likewise, you shall do with your oxen, your sheep, and it shall be with its mother 7 days. The 8th day you give it to me. In terms of more modern things, some people delay giving tithes and offerings. The Bible essentially says you're not supposed to do that. Now let's go to Exodus 22, verse 31. Because I find this kind of interesting here. And you shall be holy men to me. You shall not eat meat torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. So no, we're not supposed to go out and eat what's called roadkill, or other potentially diseased animals we might encounter. As far as dogs go, by the way, you may be aware of this, maybe not. They have different digestive abilities than human beings, and they can normally handle eating decayed flesh and that kind of stuff. Now, I want to go to 1 Peter chapter 1. Because we're supposed to be holy men to God, it says. And let's read this from the New Testament, 1 Peter 1, starting verse 13. Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, not conforming yourself to the former lusts. Some people lust after roadkill and various other things. As in your ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you shall be holy in all your conduct, because it's written, be holy, for I am holy. So we're not supposed to lust after things, we're supposed to be holy. Now let's go to the book of Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 11. I've heard Protestants quote 1 Peter 1 verse 16, be holy, for I am holy. But I don't think they understand where he's quoting from. Let's start in verse 41 of Leviticus 11. And every creeping thing that creeps on the earth shall be an abomination. It shall not be eaten. Whatever crawls in its belly, goes on all fours, has many feet among the creeping things that creeps on the earth, these you shall not eat, for they are an abomination. You shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creeps, nor shall you make yourself unclean with them, lest you be defiled by them. For I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate yourself, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Okay, we've read about that. Neither shall you defile yourself with any creeping thing that creeps in the earth, for I am the Lord who brings you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, therefore. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. So we're seeing this in the context of eating unclean animals. In verse 46, this is the law of the animals and the birds, every living creature that moves in the waters, and every creature that creeps in the earth, to distinguish between the clean and the unclean, and between the animal that may be eaten and the animal that may not be eaten. So we see in the New Testament, it says, we're quoting the scripture from the Old Testament, be holy like God is holy. In the New Testament, it says, don't follow after wrong kind of lust like people did. And Bible's warning from the Old Testament, that talked about eating unclean meats. As it turns out, by the way, early professors of Christ realized this, and the early Christians did not eat biblically unclean meat. We have a booklet, by the way, the Continuing History of the Church of God, that you may want to read. It's at the ccog.org website. That's www.ccog.org. Go in the Literature tab, and our books and booklets come up, including on the Ten Commandments and other things. Also, we have an article at the cogwriter.com website, www.cogwriter.com website, called The New Testament Church History and Unclean Meats. A lot of people will be surprised about unclean meats. A lot of people who profess Christ don't think it's an issue, and they quote to certain scriptures that they've heard misinterpretations of. And so we're supposed to be holy as God is holy, and God said to avoid unclean meats. Early Christians avoided unclean meats, and we also avoid roadkill. All right, now to the 23rd chapter of Exodus. It says, you shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. And, of course, that reminds me of the Ten Commandments, and we've got that booklet there. It's also at the ccog.org website. So this seems to be kind of an early admonition against fake news. In modern times, this would include either speaking or texting wrong information, but also people will put false things on Facebook and other forms of social media. You're not supposed to circulate a false report. Even if a lot of other people do it, as we can see in verse 2, you shall not follow a crowd to do evil. Okay, it doesn't matter that you can't say, well, everybody else is doing it wrong, so I'm going to go and do it wrong. The Bible says don't do that. One of the things that comes to mind, I wasn't planning on doing this, but if I find it, is a lot of people follow the world in terms of what holidays to keep. Okay? We're not supposed to follow the crowd to do evil. We're supposed to keep God's holy days. And so, yes, we have a booklet at the ccog.org website on this. More and more, what we're seeing from the mainstream media is that most people want this, so it must be right. Most people approve of certain forms of sexual immorality, it must be right. No, that doesn't make it right. The majority does not override right and wrong. The Ten Commandments are God's laws or statutes. Okay, continuing in verse 2, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. You're supposed to not bear false witness. You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. So the Bible says you can't say, okay, two people have a dispute, one of them is wealthy, the other is poor, and you feel sorry for the poor person, so you let them win when they shouldn't. Okay, so the Bible says don't do that. You're not supposed to be biased for or against the rich or the poor. You know, justice, Lady Justice, as some statues portray her, is supposed to be blind, has a blindfold, is supposed to be blind. It's supposed to be based upon, biblically, right, making decisions and judgments supposed to be based upon right and wrong, not a person's status. If I go the wrong way, will this powerful person bother me later? Or the person's so poor, and I don't like this rich person anyway, or whatever it might be. That's supposed to be the case. You're not supposed to show partiality, it says, or you're not supposed to pervert justice. Continuing verse 4, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him. You see the donkey of one who hates you lying under his burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. You know, I think, oh, I don't like that person. I don't want to help this person. They've got a problem. I'm not going to help them. They never helped me. They've been mean to me. They've been bad to me. They've been terrible to me. I'm not going to do it. The Bible says don't do that. Don't be like that. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 19. I'm going to start in verse 17. I'll read a couple of verses here. The Bible says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. You're not just not supposed to kill him. You're not supposed to hate him in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor yourself, for I am the Lord your God. you shall keep my statutes. What the Bible teaches. He said, but yeah, that's the Old Testament. Well, let's go to the New Testament. Matthew chapter 5. Matthew 5, starting verse 43. You've heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you. Okay? Loving your enemy, that's basically what we're seeing in Exodus 23, verse 24 and 5. Verses 4 and 5, excuse me. You see someone going around with your enemy's ox or donkey or something, you're supposed to actually help them. Act like you like them. You're supposed to love your neighbors yourself. Jesus said, you're supposed to help those who despitefully use and persecute you. That you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes the sun rise in the evil and the good, and he sends rain in the just and unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Don't even tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Don't even the tax collectors do the same? Do so. Therefore, you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. And we see in the Old Testament some of these principles that Jesus was talking about in the Sermon on the Mount. Anyway, let's go back to Exodus 23, this time verse 6. You shall not pervert the judgment of the poor in his dispute. Keep yourselves far from a false matter. Do not kill the innocent and righteous. So I would also include that as an anti-abortion position, because you shouldn't do, babies are innocent. For I will not justify the wicked. We've got a society where people justify the wicked all the time. Or they try to. They think they can. They can't really, but they think so. Verse 8, you shall take no bribe, for bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. Again, justice is to be the goal and not supposed to be biased. Anyway, verse 9. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Well, let's go to Matthew chapter 7. This lines up with what has been called the Golden Rule. Matthew 7, start verse 11. For if you, then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Or as some have reworded it from the old days, do unto others, you have them do unto you. And basically, Jesus is saying, well, Jesus is saying this here, but basically back in Exodus 23:9, it says, you know the heart of a stranger, treat the stranger like you want to be treated if you're a stranger. Anyway, let's go back to Exodus 23, this time verse 10. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its produce, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. Now that's called the land Sabbath, getting back to Exodus 23, starting verse 12. 6 days you shall do your work, and on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female servant and the stranger may be refreshed. So we see the Sabbath command is repeated again. Now let's go down to verse 13. And in all that I have said to you, be circumspect, and make no mention of the name of other gods, nor let it be heard from your mouth. To me, this looks to be an expansion of the first, second, and third commandments. Our last sermon, by the way, covered the Ten Commandments. We also have a booklet on it. Verse 14 of Exodus 23. 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. It means 3 seasons. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you at the time appointed in the month of Abib. For in it you came out of Egypt, and none will appear before me empty. And the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors which you have sown in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, which we tend to call the Feast of Tabernacles, when you've gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. 3 times all of your males will appear before the Lord your God. Now the holy days are discussed in detail in Leviticus 23. And so I'm not going to go through all the details on them here. But I mentioned this booklet before, Should You Keep God's Holy Days or Demonic Holidays? And it has more information about the holy days. Anyway, getting back to Exodus 23, this time verse 18. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until the morning. Now this is an ordinance that wouldn't tend to affect Christians. If you want, I'm going to go to Hebrews chapter 10. The reason is because we don't need to have blood sacrifices these days. This is clear from the New Testament, which is why we don't do this. Hebrews 10 verse 1. For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of things, can never, with these same sacrifices, which they offer continually year by year, make those who approach perfect. For then would they have not ceased to be offered. For the worshippers, once purified, would have had no more consciousness of sin. But in those sacrifices, there's a reminder of sin every year. For it's not possible the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. Verse 5. Therefore, when he came to the world, he said, Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offering and sacrifice for sin you had no pleasure. But I said, Behold, I have come. In the volume of the book it is written of me, to do your will, O God. So yes, we don't do blood sacrifices. They didn't permanently take things away, like sacrifice Jesus does, which only had to be done once, and this is what this is explaining. Anyway, verse 19, of Exodus 23. The first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. And again, we do tithes and offerings. There's an article at the cogwriter.com website about tithing questions and answers if you want to read that. Verse 19. You shall not boil a young kid in its mother milk. The rest of that. Now there's some controversy associated with this. The literal word in verse 19 is to seethe. It literally reads, you shall not seethe the kid in its mother's milk. Some believe this means because God doesn't want a nursing goat to be taken away from its mother, or else the mother may feel pain of not being milked. Now from this, strict Orthodox Jews won't have meat and dairy products together. And of the 613 mitzvah rules, it's actually number 163 on one list I saw. But the Bible doesn't make this as a requirement. Only the baby goat should not be boiled or seethed in its mother's milk. Okay, so some people have wondered about this. They say, well, the Jews don't eat beef with dairy. Okay, but that's not what the scripture says. It says, do not boil a kid, which is a baby goat, in its mother's milk. It doesn't say you can't have cheese with beef or butter with sheep or something, or lamb. Okay, so one of the things that Jesus criticized the Jews of his time, particularly the Pharisees, where they had extra rules that weren't in the Bible. And this is one of the other ones that ends up on that list that people don't have to do. Anyway, now in verse 20 we see God making a promise in Exodus 23 here. Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way and to bring you into the place which I prepared. Beware of him and obey his voice, and do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgressions. For my name is in him. But if you indeed obey his voice and do all I speak, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you in to the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. So it's a promise he was making to them. He says, look, I'm going to bring you in this land, obey, and I'll get rid of the enemies. Anyway, verse 24, God makes a warning. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their works, but you shall utterly overthrow them, completely break down their sacred pillars. Don't keep vestiges of paganism, God is saying. He said, but he keeps saying that. Yeah, he has to say it over and over again. So I'm saying it because he keeps saying it. Now it's in his word over and over again, so I continue to go through that. Anyway, so again, we see another reference to the second commandment. Anyway, going back to verse 25. So you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I'll take sickness away from the midst of you. So God's making promises, a requirement and promises. No one of you shall suffer miscarriage, be barren in your land, and I will fulfill the number of your days. Verse 27. I will send my fear before you. I'll cause confusion among all the people whom you'll come, and I'll make your enemies turn back their backs to you. And I will send hornets before you, which will drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, which is before you. I will not drive them all from you before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. So there's wolves or coyotes or whatever. They had lions back then too, I think. Little by little I'll drive them out before you until you've increased, and you'll inherit the land. And I'll set your bounds from the Red Sea to the sea, Philistia, and from the desert to the river. For I'll deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you'll drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. You say, yeah, but God didn't drive them all out. That's because they started to do wrong things. They didn't do what God said. God said, if you do everything, I'll get rid of them all, but they wouldn't do it. God says he wasn't going to do it immediately. And the people, they compromise because nowadays you got people who think God needs to do things quicker than he does, and don't understand all parts of God's plan. Of course, we don't know every single part, but there's some things we should realize. For example, let's go to the book of Romans, Romans chapter 8, going to verse 28. It says, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn of many brethren. So all things work together for good if we've been called, even if we have to wait. And in 1 Corinthians 10, let's go over there. Moreover, brethren, I don't want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, 1 Corinthians 10:1. All passed to the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank the spiritual rock that followed them. That rock was Christ. Kind of ties in with that angel we were just reading about. But with most of them, God was not well pleased. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now, verse 6. Now, these things became our examples. So there are a lot of things we're supposed to learn from what happened to the children of Israel. To the intent that we should not lust after things like they also lusted. Do not become idolaters, as some of them. I keep talking about these things about idolatry, but the Bible warns against it repeatedly. As it was written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now let us not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in one day 23,000 fell. We have society that promotes sexual immorality. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them complained, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stand take heed lest he fall. So don't think you don't have to improve anything, you don't have to fix anything. But also understand that no temptation has overtaken you such as common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape to be able to bear it. Okay, well now let's go to Exodus 24. We're going to finish up the judgments. This is where we'll finish these here. Starting verse 1, or at least part of it anyway. Now he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel, and worship from afar. And Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor shall the people go up with him. So verse 3. So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord, the eternal Yahweh, and all the judgments. And he said, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has said, we will do. So the people agreed to all the judgments that I've just been reading. And also, the Ten Commandments were in chapter 20, and they were mentioned then, so agreeing to the commandments and the judgments. Anyway, verse 4. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. Now, critics have claimed that Moses couldn't have written the Old Testament for lots of reasons, including they said that they didn't have the Hebrew language back then. Now, in Exodus chapter 2, the Bible shows that Moses was raised in the royal household of Pharaoh. That means he would have learned how to read things like hieroglyphics. Now, what's interesting is Wikipedia, which calls the Exodus the founding myth of the children of Israel, that is, don't believe it happened, they do admit the following. It's believed, this is something I saw yesterday there when I went over there. This is verbatim from Wikipedia then, maybe they'll change this. It is believed that the original shapes of the script, that's of the Hebrew language, go back to Egyptian hieroglyphs. Okay, so they've noticed that there are, even the secular people are saying, you see these weird Hebrew scribbles and things, kind of parts of them seem related to Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, there's a guy by the name of Dr. Doug Petrovich, and he wrote a book called The World's Oldest Alphabet, Hebrew as a language of the Proto-Consonantal script. And I watched the video that he did on this. Anyway, he claims, and he shows various artifacts, that there's connections between the Hebrew letters and Egyptian hieroglyphics. And so he says this helps demonstrate that the Hebrew language alphabet was developed from the Egyptian hieroglyphics. And, of course, presuming that's true, it supports the case that the Hebrews were in Egypt for centuries, which of course the Bible teaches. Now, according to Dr. Petrovich's translation of certain inscriptions, there's one dating from 1842 BC. It includes the phrase, Hebrews of Bethel, the beloved. Since the Hebrews, the children of Israel, needed to be in Egypt by 1876 BC, because the Bible says that they were in Egypt for 130 years from Exodus 12:40. And if the Exodus is around 1446 BC, as I think it's close to somewhere around this would mean that they would have arrived by 1876 BC. And the fact that 1842 BC, which is only 34 years later, there's actually proof or an inscription that the Hebrews were there. So we have evidence pointing to the fact that the children of Israel were in Egypt when they were supposed to be in Egypt, despite the fact, by the way, Wikipedia doesn't believe that. But the fact that I still find it cute that they at least admit that the Hebrew letters look like hieroglyphics played a role. And by the way, when I watched Dr. Petrovich's video, he said there were other inscriptions that named biblical people, such as Asenath, who's the wife of Joseph, according to Genesis 41:45. Ahisamach, who was the father of one of the craftsmen who would build the tabernacle in Exodus 35:34. And also there was actually one about Moses. And Dr. Petrovich claims, and his dating might be wrong, that this particular thing I'm going to read about Moses dates to 1446 BC, which is the year of the Exodus. It says, translated in English, our bound servitude had lingered. Moshe then provided astonishment. Now, Moses is actually Moshe, or Moshe in Hebrew. And they talk about astonishment. It's actually kind of the year of astonishment. And that's consistent, by the way, with the 10 plagues that were recorded in the book of Exodus. Let's go to let me just read this. Romans 1, verse 22. Paul wrote, professing to be wise, they become fools. And we've sadly seen a lot of people this way, these experts at Wikipedia try to say that things didn't happen, but if you put all the facts together, you find out, oops, they're wrong. They're circulating false information when they call the Exodus a founding myth. Anyway, getting back to Exodus 24, verse 4, the second half of it. And he rose early in the morning and built an altar in the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent the young men of the children of Israel who had offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood and put it in the basins, half the blood he sprinkled on the altar, and he took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people, and they said, all the Lord has said we will do and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you according to all these words. So the people agreed. Of course, when you were baptized, assuming you were, you agreed to accept Jesus as Lord. And hopefully you're working toward living up to your part of the agreement. Anyway, let's go back to verse 9 of Exodus 24. And this is the last chapter we're going to cover today. Moses went up, also Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel. And they saw the God of Israel, and there was thunder at his feet as it were a paved work of sapphire stone, and it was like the very heavens for clarity. But on the nobles of the children of Israel he did not lay his hand, so they saw God and ate and drank. Verse 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, come up with me to the mountain and be there, and I will give you tablets of stone, and the law and commandments which I have written, that you may teach them. Verse 13. So Moses arose with his assistant Joshua. It's the same Joshua that the book of Joshua is named after. And Moses went back to the mountain of God, and he said to the elders, wait here for us till we come back to you. Indeed, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man has difficulty, let go of him. Let him go to them. Then Moses went up the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. Verse 16. Now the glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And on the seventh day he called Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain and in the eyes of the children of Israel. So Moses went into the midst of the cloud and went up into the mountain. And Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. That's a long time. Can you wait? Moses was on the mountain too long for lots of people as far as they were concerned. But that's how long God wanted them there. Sometimes we have to wait longer than God thinks. God sometimes wants us to wait longer than we think that we need to do. Well, anyway, this covers Exodus chapter 21 through 24. My intent is to start with chapter 25 next week. Again, we're trying to go through scriptures. Our sermons consist of lots of scriptures. We try to go through the Bible. We do go through the Bible and try to explain what it means. And the fact is, things that happened in the book of Exodus are still applicable to us today. So don't think, it's just Old Testament, done away and it doesn't matter at all. A lot of these things still affect us now, or should affect our societies now. And sadly, societies have discounted Scripture and don't want to go by God's judgments. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Continuing Church of God.